The sea is a force to be reckoned with and respected. Many people brave its waters never to return, or return with stories of horrors from the deep. It's time to get comfortable, put on your life vest, and let the darkness take control. I was assigned to the USS Salva in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, as a midshipman in the late 1980s. The Salva was a Navy rescue and salvage ship with a small crew and used mainly to recover damaged ships or scuttle ships past their lifespan to create artificial reefs or gunnery targets. I think it's since been decommissioned and is now part of Military Sealift Command. Anyway, I was 18 and serving my summer duty, which included a lot of boring night watches, usually between 11 PM and 5 AM. Lots of mindless chit-chat, walking around with a flashlight and drinking lots of coffee to stay awake. On one of those late nights, about an hour past midnight, we got a call over the radio. A Liberty boat used to ferry sailors between the island and larger Navy ships had caught a rogue wave and capsized. As you can imagine, Pearl Harbor is a crowded port, and many larger ships will anchor a few miles out and send their crew in on these smaller, more maneuverable boats. They usually hold 20 to 30 people, but this one was packed with about 40 sailors returning from a night of hard partying and drinking. The seas were calm that night, but getting out of Pearl can be treacherous, especially at night and if the boat crew is unfamiliar with the tides. Apparently the boat got too close to a shallow reef where the waves begin to roll. A wave hit the ship broadside and knocked a person overboard. The wave itself wasn't strong enough to capsize the boat, but when the crowd shifted on one side to look for the missing person, a second wave and the imbalance made it tip over and dump everyone onto the reef. Then it got worse, because the boat, partially filled with water, was now stuck between the reef and the pounding surf. So, if you can imagine, it's getting dark, and you're getting thrown repeatedly against jagged coral by a ton of seawater, and, oh yeah, you're drunk. It was standard protocol for every ship to assist in a search, and we responded by launching 2 small crafts. I was in one of them, manning the searchlight. Our boat was a small 30-footer, and it had a large searchlight mounted on a tripod. It reminded me of one that you might see on an old movie set. It takes about 20 minutes to get close to the accident, and we've got to maneuver so we don't end up in the same situation. Remember, this was before GPS, so our helmsman had a general idea of the accident location and was taking a bearing and using the boat's compass to get us there. Real old school. As we approached the scene, I could see the silhouette of the hull, but couldn't hear much over our engines. As we cut the engines, we tried to home in on anyone in distress. It was eerie because there was very little moonlight, so objects went from invisible to brightly illuminated by the searchlight, then lost again in the dark. I started seeing shoes, just empty tennis shoes, and then life vests bobbing up and down in the spotlight, but no people. Then we saw parts of the boat. The waves had battered the boat against the reef and started tearing it apart. It looked more like the scene of a plane crash. You could also hear a rhythmic thum, 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 spaced about 30 seconds apart, as the wave beat the boat against the reef. Finally, we heard screams, and we shined the searchlight to see a group of 3 to 5 people clinging together and screaming. As we got closer to pour them on the boat, we realized they weren't screaming for help. It turns out most sailors on the boat were Navy divers and a few SEALs, but there were also a few girlfriends picked up earlier that night who shouldn't have even been on the boat. Even intoxicated, the sailors knew exactly what to do as soon as they hit the water. Ditch your shoes and life jacket. In heavy surf, the life jacket just adds to your surface area and makes it harder to swim away from the reef. Some of the girls apparently didn't know, and were trapped between the reef and the boat. A few Coast Guard boats and helos showed up around that time, and the professionals took over the rescue operation. We stayed on the scene for another hour, swinging the searchlight looking around for any stragglers. I believe at least 2 people died that night, pinned between the reef and the swamped boat. I think a second person may have drowned unable to swim due to intoxication. Not necessarily the scariest story, but it was definitely a night I will remember. My dad used to be an abalone diver as a young man in Victoria. Money by the bag if you wanted it enough. Though half the guys that do it act like they're on cocaine most of the time from the nitrogen in their blood. So it's a dangerous game you can only play for so long. There's one story he told me once, and only when he got drunk on his 50th, about an encounter he had whilst diving with a mate. The water down in that part of Australia is thick and black and cold. The kelp is so thick that some people get lost in it. They tangle their breather hose and, more often than you'd think, just disappear. Anyway, he's diving off a shelf face about 90 meters, and it's completely black. He says you would just pull yourself along the face, grabbing abalone by feel. The pressure is enormous, and there are great whites swimming around with their mouths open, who regularly attack divers and cut air hoses, which means by the time you realize, you're dead. Well, without rambling, he was making his way along this shelf, collecting and felt a nudge on his back. His mate and him always worked in close tandem, so he just assumed it was him and reached out to pull him closer. But as soon as his hand touched it, it just smashed him out the way and got its tail wrapped around the air hose, which ripped it off the connector to my dad's mask. So he immediately got his little pen light out that he kept on his diving belt for checking cuts, which were bad to get when there are Noahs around, and he sees the end of the hose a few meters away, spewing bubbles. The thing that gives me chills is the way he describes that in the inky darkness 90 meters down, he could see nothing but the reflection of the bubbles from the hose and the dark, lifeless eyes of the great white behind it. From what I can piece together from the old story and anecdote, it was the last dive he ever did, recreational or commercial. He never told anyone except me and one of his brothers, and I'd never dare tell my mum. I was on a sailing boat, heading out of the Straits of Gibraltar, on the way across the Atlantic. I was on watch. It was the middle of the night, and picked up a boat on radar to the northeast, doing about 6 knots. I watched it coming in, and made a course correction to keep a safe distance and show I intended to pass port side to the port side. Over the next couple of minutes, the other vessel slowly altered course to bring the range down that we would pass at. This is a bit of an arsehole move, but not uncommon. If it's my duty to move out of your way, I do so, and leave a mile clearance as we pass. Some guys, mainly Eastern Europeans I find, if they're off course themselves, will push into that mile to get back on course. They're not supposed to, but it happens. So, I figure, arsehole at the helm, but the course continues to correct until he's on collision course with me. By this point we're quite a lot closer, so I have to make another direct correction to avoid a collision, while pointing out the arsehole move to my buddy on watch with me, and try to hail the guy on radio. Again, the oncoming boat alters and cuts into that mile. At this point I was concerned. I asked my buddy to wake the captain. We're not in any danger of collision as we're doing 14 knots and they're doing 6. However, we're not maintaining a safe distance anymore, and being off the coast of North Africa, there's a chance that we're about to meet some pirates. So by the time the captain gets there, the course is closed to collision again. I explain the situation, and the captain takes command and makes another correction. Still, the boat follows us, but doesn't have the speed to turn this into a collision course. In the end, we pass a couple of 100 meters, point the searchlight to the boat, and it's about a 40-foot sailboat under full sail with wind vane steering and no one at the helm, just cruising about wherever it feels like. The wind had come round by chance as we manoeuvred, and left this nutcase with a boat heading down the west coast of Africa. But I guess the destination was supposed to be the Mediterranean. It was quite creepy to watch. My dad worked in the offshore drilling industry in Nigeria in the 90s, and him and some French company men were heading out on a platform when they got boarded by pirates. 5 Frenchmen got beheaded before my dad and the rest of the crew took the ship back. He told me about this when I asked him if he ever killed someone. He said he didn't know, but when you smack a dude with an iron bar and he falls into the sea and doesn't come back up, he might be dead. He still has nightmares about it. The company he worked for, Alberta Abela Catering, had a compound outside of Lagos, Nigeria. It had a 14-foot high concrete wall with battlements, razor wire, and sniper towers. It had a full-time security staff of mercenaries from somewhere, I think it was the Congo. And one night, the Igbo tribesmen decided to raid the compound. So, like 100 of these guys assaulted the compound, throwing thick rugs over the razor wire and having guys lay on it and their bodies run over the top. The mercenaries managed to kill all of them, and I think 5 of the mercs got killed with machetes. My dad said they were burning bodies for 2 days after that. It just goes to show how serious these people are about security, and how dangerous all of it really is. To give a little context here, for most of my life, I have endeavored to be as rational and as scientific as possible, and thus have been skeptical about the supernatural. I'm 33 now. I came to the realization that I cannot intellectually claim any certitude about whether or not supernatural entities exist. But emotionally, I believe in something. It was a hard thing to come to terms with, actually. I think I had a bit of cognitive dissonance. Rationally, these things do not exist, but I still believe that they do, if that makes any sense. My personal encounters with the ghosties are pretty mild. But when I was very young, a door slammed in the basement, in a room where my sister, cousin, best friend and I were playing. We paused, looked at each other with terror-stricken faces, then clambered over each other, trying to run upstairs as fast as we could. We all remember the encounter to this day. Another time, I walked downstairs and saw my deceased grandfather's old rocking chair rocking back and forth by itself. Now this thing is really heavy. I mean, it's like a rocking chair built for industrial purposes. Thick, heavy wood, and it is a rocking back and forth. Full swing. There was no one else in the basement, so I thought that perhaps my cat had been sleeping on it and jumped off, and was hiding somewhere. After all, she did sleep there on occasion. A few months later, I saw my cat jump off the thing. She was on the very edge of the seat, which I imagine would create the most leverage for rocking. It did not budge an inch. But the story I wanted to tell you was one that happened to one of my friend's fathers, Vance. Vance is the quintessential outdoorsman. I would be hard-pressed to choose between him or Lestrade if I were ever lost in the woods and got to choose someone to be lost with me. He is a special needs teaching aide. Suffice to say, he is one of the nicest human beings that I have ever had the pleasure of knowing, and I have never known him to lie or exaggerate for that matter. He told the story just like he told his funny stories. He laughed throughout the whole thing, as if he couldn't believe what had happened to him. Anyway, in his younger years, he and one of his friends took a job for the Canadian government, where they had to catalogue an old ferry wreck in a lake in British Columbia somewhere. Apparently, sometime in the late 1800s, I know, nice and vague. It had sunk a bunch of passengers who obviously died, or something along those lines. I would imagine it was sometime during the gold rush when ramshackle business popped out of nowhere. I cannot remember exactly, but I think he said it was Pigeon Lake, not the one in Alberta, but I could be wrong. No one seems to live on that lake today, from my satellite views of Google Earth, but there is another lake near it that seems to be a camping spot. Anyway, Vance and his friend, who are both certified divers, are driven and boated to the middle of the lake. They were the only ones there, as it was secluded, and seems to be to this day. The water is a bit murky. They have flashlights and have an alright view of things. They dive down. It may have been so deep that they had to acclimatise as to not to get the bends, but I have probably just added that myself over time. Either way, just as they're getting their first glimpse of the wreck, like something out of a horror film, a dude swims out of the scary as shit depths, rips the breathing nozzle out of Vance's mouth, takes a breath, and swims away. Both guys see and feel this. Vance puts his breathing apparatus back in his mouth, Obviously, they look at each other like, "What the hell?" and then head for the surface. Initially, their minds went to semi-rational places, and they thought someone had come out in another boat and dove down. So they come up all concerned for this guy who was diving to dangerous depths. I do believe they actually went back down to catalogue the wreck without further incident, because Vance is hardcore like that. Anyway, the story always scared the bejesus out of me. I would be freaked out to see a ghost, let alone one at the bottom of a lake. I was racing in the 1997/1998 Whitbread Round the World race. We were sailing through the Bass Straits that separates Australia from Tasmania. We were running downwind in about 30 knots of breeze, with a massive Code 3 spinnaker doing about 20 knots boat speed in a confused sea state. Because of the stresses and strains on the rigging, we had to send someone up to the top of the 90-foot mast to literally tie the sail to the mast. We drew straws, and I got the short one. I had to go up. It was terrifying. Pitch black in the middle of the night. No moon, no stars. You couldn't see the difference between the sky and the water. Next thing, you're up there clinging to a freezing cold aluminium pole that's doing everything it can to whip you off it. It all went to plan. Right until the point where they began lowering me and I lost my grip on the rigging, still attached to the halyard. I was flung some 40 feet from the mast and got tangled up in the rigging and banged my head against something, blacking out for a moment. We're not allowed to mention names, but one of my mates, let's call him Hero 1, made the decision to release the halyard and drop me on deck, rather than watch me get turned into a ragdoll in the rigging. I fell 50 feet to the deck. At this point, another sailor, let's call him Hero 2, literally caught me in his arms. I was semi-conscious. A third teammate, Hero 3, had medical training and was able to stabilize me. Luckily, we were only 300 miles from finish in Sydney and managed to get second for the leg. Things can go wrong really fast at sea. Sometimes we're asked to do things that are not strictly speaking safe, certainly not the norm. But going out to sea with the right people and the right equipment can sometimes make all the difference when things go wrong. I raced the Whitbread/Volvo Ocean Race 3 times. It's a 39,000-mile round-the-world odyssey that takes 9 months to complete. If you like the idea of extreme camping, you should check it out. The next edition starts soon. Half of the race happens at night, and while the next crop of sailors are out there, I'll be enjoying following them from the comfort of home. I was part of a search and rescue team in Tampa Bay. We were responding to a 34 Hunter adrift in a bad storm, a couple of miles offshore. When we were alongside, hooking up our tow harness, our boat and the Hunter were at that perfect distance, where the Hunter would be at the peak of the wave and we would be at the trough. So the boats were rising and falling opposite from each other in heavy seas, which most people know is a recipe for disaster, broken bones, or worse. as I'm hanging over the stern, trying to thread their trailer eye with our tow line. Our boats rotated all of a sudden, so that our stern was directly in front of their bow. The Hunter had a huge water spike anchor on the winch attached to the bowsprit. The two blades of the anchor were facing straight down and came crashing towards my face like a guillotine. Out of nowhere, the crew members helping with the tow bridle grabbed me by my PFD and yanked me out the way. One of the blades caught my uniform collar and ripped it clean off just as I was getting yanked out of the way. She saved my life that day, and I don't doubt it for a second. I also had a few words with the coxswain driving our boat once we were back at the dock. This happened to my dad when I was a kid. We lived on the Oregon coast and had a San Juan 23-foot-long sailboat. He had a small 6 HP Johnson outboard on the back for motoring in and out of the marina. He had painted the hull below the waterline with a blue anti-barnacle paint, as he was wont to do. He was out sailing in the ocean one night with a friend. There was a good swell going on, and at one point they caught an extra large one. They seemed to hang up in the air a bit longer than usual, and then my dad felt the tiller twist in his hands. He looked back at the rudder and saw that the brakes which held the rudder on the back of the boat had been completely ripped out, and the rudder was now floating atop the water. With no way to steer the boat, he had to drop the Johnson in the water and use that to get back into harbour. Although they never saw it, they surmised that a whale came up under them, perhaps mistaking the painted hull for another whale, and gently bumped them, causing the rudder to be ripped off the brackets. As you can probably imagine, if the whale had applied just that bit more force, there's a good chance a bit more than the rudder would have been destroyed from that boat that night. I was crewing a boat on the annual Newport Ensenada race in 2012, and we were the ones who first discovered and reported the wreckage of a boat, including 2 of the dead sailors who had been on board. It was a beautiful morning. We were just blowing along at a good 6 knots, when suddenly there was all this debris in the water. We had just crossed into Mexico, so we weren't sure what to make of it, until one of the crew in the front of the boat said, "Hey, is that a dead guy?" Sure enough, it was a shirtless body, floating face down in the water, amidst a lot of other debris spread out over a large area. Eventually, we saw another body, but nothing to really tell what kind of boat it is. We weren't sure what to think of it. My first thought was a drug deal gone bad, so the captain decided to radio it in and keep on course. Let the professionals handle it. There was a Coast Guard helicopter on the scene within 5 minutes after we made the report, and then later, we learned little bits and pieces of information. For a while, we thought that it must have been a boat that ran into a large cargo ship running without lights or whatever. It gets very dark at night, and it wasn't a long time after we found the crew probably ran aground into an island in the early morning, and the boat disintegrated onto the rocks. All 4 of the crew were presumably killed, but I think they only found 3 of the bodies. So... The summer of 2012, I was fortunate enough to join a voyage from Bermuda to Haiti on the fastest tall ship, the Spirit of Bermuda. I was on deck on a watch which lasted from 8 p.m. to 12 a.m. I usually volunteered for bow watch, where you look out for debris, other ships, and whatever the instruments don't catch. The trip was fun, although generally uneventful until this fateful Saturday. It was 11:30 p.m, and there's moonlight, some clouds and stars. I could see quite clearly, so as per usual, I volunteered for bow watch so that I could skip out on any serious responsibilities, as I was 17. I'm leaning against the forward mast, gazing at the horizon and humming songs to myself. My eyes shift from port to starboard and up and down until they lock on a cloud cruising along the sky. Suddenly, the cloud parts and a long blue streak descends all the way into the horizon. Shooting star, right? No. The sky flashed a bright blue as well. Lightning? No. The night was calm as hell, and this beam of light was perfectly straight. I was sitting in blank awe for a couple of moments. Then I immediately ran for my watch officers at the stern of the ship. Everyone on watch that night was standing up with their mouths wide open. We all exchanged glances. I broke the silence and asked what was it. My watch officer, Jake, shakes his head and tells me he doesn't know, then taps the other officer, telling him to wake up the captain. I went down into the cabin to see if I could steal a peek at the sonar, as only officers could be around the instrumentals, but nothing was on the scope. The captain ended up telling everyone that it was no big deal and to carry on. To this day, I wish I knew what that was on the horizon. Rogue wave, sailing in an open ocean race. At night, my friend and I on watch during a light storm. Suddenly, the whole boat is gone. All we can see is an eerie green glow from the lights in the cockpit and the navigation station. But they are underneath us, about 4 feet. We hit the end of our lifelines, life jackets inflate, and a few seconds that seemed like an eternity tick by, with us getting pulled under. Then the boat suddenly bursts up out of the water. Several more seconds go by that seem like frantic minutes or hours as the boat drains. I'm climbing over the lifelines and look to my friend, who is now on the other side of the boat. We were sitting right beside each other, now tangled in the aft corners of the lifelines. We get everything under control. About the time the watch below realizes that there's a few thousand gallons of water sloshing around with them. Someone opened a hatch to get some air, and the inside of the boat flooded when we went under. After a lot of screaming and yelling, the bilges drained the boat pretty quickly. Everything was drenched. Food, equipment, people. My mate and I sat down with our still inflated life jackets and just started laughing hysterically and gave each other a big hug. I have been inside burning houses, worked horrible car accidents, jumped out of planes and climbed mountains. That experience was the most adrenaline-fueled, fearful, oh shit moment of my life. When I looked down and saw this giant 44-foot boat swallowed by the abyss, a sinking boat glowing under me, knowing I was tied to it. I thought, this is it. This is how you're going to die. 10 out of 10 would do it again though. I am a Coast Guard. I've sailed the Caribbean, Atlantic, and Pacific. The coolest things I've seen have been an oarfish, stumfish, dead whale that started a shark-eating frenzy, several water spouts, a leatherback turtle the size of a Volkswagen, a blue whale, grey whale migration, the Milky Way through night vision goggles, and more drugs than you can imagine, and many other things. The strangest thing I've seen is a UFO. I shit you not. I was on mid-watch from midnight to 4 a.m. I was the lookout and noticed this light in the distance. We weren't by land and the radar didn't show anything. I watched this light gain and lose altitude and go back and forth for over an hour. I was pretty transfixed by this thing. I wish it would have gotten closer. The scariest thing I saw though were the 60-foot waves. We were off the coast of Oregon when a big-ass storm came down from the Gulf of Alaska. We were getting tossed around like a rag doll, and nobody was allowed to go outside, but you could still go to the bridge and such. Well, I went up there and saw waves passing us that were 10 feet higher than our bridge. I went up one deck where the lookout was, and for as far as the eye could see, the waves were massive. That storm nearly destroyed our boat. A lot of stuff got bent and smashed. We lost all the gear off the tail fan. It was crazy. It's funny how the sea can make you feel very, very small indeed. I served in the Navy on SSBN submarines. We were doing drills by the coast of Alaska in the winter. Think deadliest catch type waves. I was on my way to drive the boat and we had to come up to the periscope depth for the drill. As we're coming up, you can start to feel the waves really bad. I have to hold onto the walls as I'm moving around the boat. Sometimes I have to stop unless I want to slide down the hallway. I look around and things are coming untied. It's getting crazy. I start to wonder if I can even make it the 100 feet to go stand watch. We are going up and down so fast, there are movements that my feet are not touching the ground. I'm thinking that we're surfaced. Then I hear that we're about to get to periscope depth. In a sea, state 9+, with hurricane force winds. I hurry to go relieve the watch and buckle in. And things start getting really scary. We get to the depth as best we could, and everyone is trying their best to keep the ship level. The ship is rolling like crazy. The only thing keeping me in my seat is the seatbelt. On the intercom, 3 people are injured from things coming unbolted. It's so bad out, the periscope is useless because we keep going from 100 foot under to 50 feet in the air, and the air is filled with sea foam. Then the wave I tell my grandkids about someday happened. The submarine goes almost vertical. You can hear the screams of men worried they will never get to see their wives and girlfriends again, and wondering if they will get to see tomorrow. Then we hit the peak of the wave. The depth gauge isn't working because it's out of the water. The boat comes down fast. The submarine hits the water and everything goes blank for a second. I begin thinking this is how I die. The lights turn on, and we're told to go as deep as possible. Then everything returns back to normal. That is the story of how I took $1 billion ship flying. There was one time where we were testing the oxygen generators during a fire drill before going underway. To give you some context, the oxygen generators are about the size of a small car and use electricity to make oxygen. And there are 2 of them in a small room, I would say 15 by 30 feet big. This room is filled with pumps and pipes, and there are 2 ways in and out of the room, a metal staircase to go to the next level, and a door to go into a hallway. The fire drill was to put out a fake fire in this small room, while safely managing these oxygen generators. The fire drill started, and we have 2 teams with 2 fire hoses, people monitoring the drill, and a guy managing the 2 oxygen generators going into this place. There are probably 15 people in this small space. It's a tight fit, and I'm in full gear with a heavy tank on my back. The next thing I know, I hear the guy on the generators yelling at the top of his lungs for everyone to get out now. He's pushing people out, telling them to run. People are not sure if it's part of the drill. Some people run, others stay. I was one of the 7 that stayed. I looked over to the generators, and this guy is pushing buttons, twisting valves and pulling switches. He then just starts running to the stairs. Turns out, the guy was trying to stop them from decompressing and exploding whilst killing everyone in the room. At this point, I realized it wasn't part of the drill and started pushing back. I got to the doorway when everything went to shit. I saw the brightest light I've ever seen come from those oxygen generators. After that, I saw the man that was running from the generators get flung like a rag doll through the railing on the metal stairs. About the same time, the shockwave hit me and flung me into a steel wall. I wake up in the hallway, being dragged away with my ears ringing and my back messed up. I was covered in water. Everything was covered in water. Turns out, the explosion compressed the water right out of the air. The explosion was so loud, people heard it through a 3-inch steel door over 100 feet away. Thankfully, nobody died, and the guy that saved me got a medal and is still in the Navy today. I have a story. I once saw something really strange that happened at sea. An object out above the water, like a dark disc. It seemed like it just appeared out of nowhere. No visible approach. Just 1 second it was clear sky, and the next, there's this hovering black object over the water, a good bit. This was happening in the middle of the day, and we were standing on deck looking at it, with a couple of guys shouting about it with the typical, "What the hell is that?" This thing hovers there for about 30 seconds. Then, faster than we could see, hits the water. I assume it did, because there was a big splash, and it was obviously something that had gotten from the air into the water and disappears. A minute later, 2 FA-18 Super Hornets burn past directly over where this thing was hovering, not more than a minute or so before. The jets looked like they immediately pulled up after flying by the position where the thing decided to hit the water. This thing literally was there and it was gone. It looked black, but may have just been a shadow from the sun. Just a disc, no noise, no propulsion, no sounds at all. Just a weird feeling that came with its appearance and watching it dart into the ocean. We don't know what we saw, and we all kind of stood there looking at each other and watching the water over there for a while. Then we had to go on with our days. No one ever told us what it was, and it seemed too unbelievable to ask anyone. No one wanted to go on over the radio talking about UFOs or aliens either. And, as we all just assumed, the authorities knew, because there seemed to be Navy jets flying after it. I don't think anyone really reported it. Who do you even think reports that when the US military says they aren't interested in them? One guy did take some video of it, and also caught the fighter jets fly past after the object entered the water. So, whenever I hear of, oh, if there was some UFO, someone would have caught it on camera, I tell them this: there are, and we have. I don't know what it was, but I don't think of UFO people the way I used to. I also guess from this that if they can move so fast, that's why we don't see them. Then it makes sense too. I was fishing in Florida, Gulf Coast, for grouper that we were going to eat later that evening. So me and a few buds out to this common wreck that sits on top of a pre-existing reef. No luck, but this isn't a problem. We would just go further and go for tuna. The fish also known as mahi-mahi. So we head out to this drop-off. The actual marine mammals start following us in our wake. Now this isn't uncommon whatsoever. I watched them blissfully whilst the rest of my friends were looking on the charts for where we start to drift. All of a sudden, the fish are gone. This sort of eerie feeling comes over me, and one singular, small dolphin is in our wake. Then, a massive column of water erupts from behind us. I see a red cloud where the dolphin should have been, and that's the closest I've ever been to shitting myself. My instinct is to run and get my friends, and then get a line in the water. They were dismissive, but it happened near the drop-off anyway, and they do turn around. They can see the slightly diluted cloud of blood where the dolphin was. We get a line in the water, and after 5 minutes, it keels over and snaps. We get one with a wire lead in the water, and nothing bites. Honestly, it was a mako, or maybe a great white shark, but it was just the strangest thing that's ever happened whilst fishing. Oh, and we caught a 75-pound yellowfin that day, and it was some of the best fish I've ever eaten. One time, I was with my dad when I was 10, and we boated out to the Sombrero Key Lighthouse to snorkel. Sombrero Lighthouse is 5.5 miles offshore, and the water is pretty deep at some points. It was a very choppy day, and so, on the way, I immediately knew it was a bad idea. So once we got out there, we got our gear and dove in. After 5 minutes of staring down into 20 to 50 feet of darkness and mixed up sand, I noticed about 10 to 15 shaded objects darting around in the water. Not thinking about it, we ignored it for a while. We didn't realize we were surrounded by sharks until we saw a grouper getting eaten right below us. Fear and panic swooped over me as I turned into Michael Phelps and tried to bolt the hell out of there. After what seemed like forever, I noticed that my dad was already on the boat and that I was even further away. It turns out I'm no Michael Phelps, and the waves were now 10 feet high and they took me back further every time. It took me 20 minutes to swim back to the boat while swallowing water and crying. Once I got on, I threw up multiple times and we went home. I'm still thankful the sharks didn't bite us and that we didn't drown. That trip sucked. My dad owns a fishing boat. So, we used to go offshore fishing very often when I was younger. I have a few not so creepy stories. The first one was on our trip to the Florida Keys. We were maybe 30 miles offshore, no land or other vessels in sight. We were hauling ass away from some really quickly approaching storm clouds when I saw a funnel cloud appear. It was kind of eerie being an 8-year-old, seeing this shit a few thousand feet behind you, knowing that if it got close enough to us, we didn't make it. No one would ever know for a long time, and there's nothing we could do about it. Another time, when I was 10, we were trolling on fish 40 miles off the coast of Bimini in the Bahamas, and this large lump floated within a few feet of our boat. It was a dead sea turtle, a pretty big one too. We gaffed it, flipped it over in the water, and there was a huge basketball-sized hole through its underside, and it went all the way through its body until it reached its shell area. It was like a nice neat cylinder had been carved out of its body, and it looked flat black. I don't know if it was just rotting, but it almost looked charred. Turtle also had numerous hooks and cut lines coming out of its mouth, which is pretty normal for dead ones. We set it loose. The last story. I was around the same age, and we were offshore fishing for mahi pretty much all day. I don't remember if we were on the Gulf side or Atlantic side, but the water was seriously deep and blue. We must have been many miles offshore and looking at the sonar, and I remember it being much deeper than 2,000 feet. Anyway, about midday, bored 10-year-old me was sitting on the roof of our center console, and I see this dark shape about 20 feet under the surface. It was seriously huge and definitely not a whale or anything. It was a man-made, gigantic-ass submarine, and it was right next to our boat, like 20 feet away. It stayed next to us for about 60 seconds, then submerged slowly and went on its way. It was so creepy, seeing it out in the middle of absolutely nowhere, and knowing that there were people right inside it, probably staring at us. My dad and I were fishing off the Florida Keys. We had our anchor out and had been fishing for about an hour. 15 minutes later, the boat gets bumped and we rock a little bit. My dad jokes, saying, "Looks like Jaws is after us, better stay away from the edges." 10 seconds after him saying that, the boat begins moving backwards, as if we're being towed by our anchor line that's in the water. Whatever it was is now dragging the boat backwards, slowly getting faster, and our boat is getting pulled under too. Next thing I hear is, "There's no bloody way." As my dad drops his pole, runs from the front to the back, grabs a knife, and cuts the anchor line. After that, we decided that fishing was not in the cards for that day. I've had some very scary things happen to me whilst out at sea. The first is that a sailor on a smaller ship in our battle group jumped and killed herself. They stored her body in our freezer, in that we had more room, until we pulled into port. Security personnel always wear their cover, but have to take it off in the mess decks. They say it's to honor the dead. Bonus story. I was 18, slightly nerdy, and I was not a drinker by any means. Let's get to the funniest part of this entire story out the way right now. I'll admit it, I had a bowl cut. You'll see. I was best buds with two guys I had known for years, Ryan and Dave. Ryan's dad was an airline pilot and had some free tickets to Hawaii, so he offered to take us all on a long weekend. Needless to say, we were stoked. I had never been to Hawaii before, and I was looking forward to the experience very much. I'm 35 years old now, and my memories are spotty, but I will describe things as best I can. The flight was long, but soon enough we arrived in the base model Ford Mustang convertible capital of the world. It seemed as if that were the only car available to rent on the island. Ryan, Dave and I were lucky enough to have our own room, which meant trouble at that age. We did some bar hopping and found it quite difficult to get alcohol from bartenders, since we all looked pretty damn young. Desperate times required desperate measures, so we found a guy in the stairwell in a hotel named Cal and asked him to buy us some booze. He agreed, and the debauchery ensued. Dave and I did a bit of drinking in the hotel room, and Ryan did quite a bit more. He was in pretty bad shape, and the place was a disaster. Beer cans were strewn about, and everything was a complete disarray. Ryan was sitting on the toilet in the bathroom, puking into the shower, when his dad called. He didn't like what he heard and said that he was coming up to check on us. He was in the same hotel only a few floors away, so we freaked out. It was a mad scramble to clean up the room and put the beer cans into a trash bag and dispose of it in the stairwell before his dad got there. We kept Ryan in the bathroom and somehow convinced his dad that everything was acceptable and he just had a stomach bug. In hindsight, his dad almost surely knew what was going on, as he kept a much closer eye on us from there on out. On one of our adventures outside of the hotel that night, we saw an advertisement in a bar for a booze cruise. The flyer made it sound like a ton of fun, complete with hot chicks, music, dancing, alcohol, and a massive floating trampoline. What more could an 18-year-old ask for? Absolutely nothing, so we decided to see if Ryan's dad would allow us to go. I believe we told him that we wanted to go on a cruise, while conveniently leaving out the part about the booze. So he didn't seem to have much of a problem with us going. There was a catch. The booze cruise was on a Sunday, and Ryan's family were quite religious. Dave and I were given the option to go to Sunday Mass, while Ryan was not. We all went back to the hotel room that night to ponder the situation. The next day, we all met up with Ryan's dad early in the morning and rendered our verdict. In true Top Gear spirit, when one of the comrades was in need and the open road was ahead of us, Dave and I did what we had to do. We left Ryan to go to church with his dad and got the hell on that ship. And damn, was that a good decision. Sort of. I went to a small high school with a graduating class of less than 60, and definitely wasn't a big partier. This cruise was absolutely nuts, especially for me. Loud music was blasting, tons of meatheads were screaming and being obnoxious. Beautiful women in skimpy bikinis were on their backs with cheering crowds around them as whipped cream was sprayed into their navels. Guys were doing body shots off of topless girls, making out, you name it. It was paradise for Dave and I, but we needed some alcohol to really let loose. Now that I think about it, I'm not quite sure how we managed to get on the booze cruise in the first place, since the minimum age was 21. Lol. Regardless, we decided to chance it and go ask the bartender for a drink, hoping he wouldn't ask us for ID. Dave looked older than I did, so he was nominated to do the deed. If he was successful, our drink of choice was going to be Long Island iced tea. He made it up to the bar and wasn't looking too confident in himself, and I was getting worried that we were going to be busted for being on a booze cruise underage. No good. Dave eventually went for it, hands shaking, and he got lucky. The bartender didn't ID him, and he came back with the massive drink. We were stoked, to say the least. Again, keep in mind that neither of us were big drinkers. Also keep in mind that the bartender made this Long Island iced tea extremely strong. Well, let me tell you something. This Long Island iced tea absolutely obliterated me. I became a flaming idiot and lost every single bit of common sense I had. I guess that was the goal, but this was a bit more than I'd planned for. By this point, everyone was extremely intoxicated as well, as the escapades were only getting more girls gone wild-esque. At the peak of my drunkenness, the boat came to a stop and anchored in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Everyone started jumping off the back of the boat and getting into the massive floating trampoline that was being dragged behind it. This was amazing for Dave and me. Boobs were bouncing everywhere and we were drunk out of our minds. Every once in a while, we would mention poor Ryan, who was probably sitting in the pew beside his father, singing hymns at Sunday Mass. Oh well, the show must go on. I then decided to join the festivities. When I do things, I normally go all out. It's all or nothing for me, and that would prove to be a bit problematic in this case. All of the other drunk people were jumping off the back of the boat, which was the proper place to jump off the boat, as it was lower and intended for such purpose. This didn't seem to be cool enough for me, however, as I climbed up on the side of the boat and let out a scream, then jumped into the ocean, fully clothed, with my wallet in my pocket. My wallet was forced out my pocket by the sudden impact from the 20-foot plus jump into the water, and unbeknownst to me, promptly sank to the bottom of the ocean floor. Dave and I continued to have a great time on the booze cruise, and our lives were perfect. I didn't realize that I lost my wallet until we disembarked the ship and got back to terra firma. This was not a good situation. At all. But fortunately, it was all pre-9/11, and Ryan's dad could pull some strings since he was a pilot. I eventually made it back to continental United States and got a new license from the DMV. All was normal for a couple of years. If you're still with me, then you're about to be rewarded just like I was. 2 years later, my mum received a manila envelope in the mail sent from Colorado and addressed to me. I opened the envelope, and inside I found my wallet, worn and filled with sand, with my faded ID card and the tattered remains of a $20 bill inside. Also, in the envelope, was a handwritten letter that read, "My husband, Oliver, found your wallet in 90 feet of water. He was doing his 2 weeks with the Navy Reserves. He teaches scuba and is a master instructor. That day, he had a group of 8 people out in the ocean when he found your wallet. I hope you received this and haven't moved. I wonder how long it's been in the ocean in Hawaii. Sincerely, Margarita." I was floored. I could not believe this wallet made it back to me, years after my stupid ass had lost it in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. We were miles from shore when I jumped off the side of the boat, and as the letter said, the diver found my wallet in 27.432 meters of water. Absolutely astonishing, if you ask me. My mum saved it for all these years, and I just got around to taking some pictures earlier tonight. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the story, guys. You'll be able to find the picture as proof on screen. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. The sea can be very dangerous, so please be careful in its waters, and let there be one less horror story in the world. Also, to make things easier for anyone new, I've spent a while organising a whole lot of new playlists on my channel. If you just scroll down the main channel page, you'll be able to find them. I hope you guys enjoy. If you liked the video, please remember to drop it a big thumbs up and consider subscribing, and hit the little bell icon for even more stories every day. Don't forget that if you would like me to read your story on my channel, you can send it to my email or share it to my Reddit, which is of course available in the description. Please make sure you include as much description and punctuation as possible to maximize the chances of it being read. But anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.